Hello everyone, Justin Lazaro here. In this video I'm going to be talking about my ultimate trim generator tool that's available for download on Gumroad. This video is going to focus on how to use the tool in Substance Painter. There's another video available for Substance Designer that I will link to in the description. So I'll be going over how to create full width trim elements, partial width trim elements, using an input image to create custom rectangular trim elements, adjusting the bevel for all of those elements, and how to access trim masks and a height map. I'll also be going over how you can import geometry and set up your Substance Painter project for working with trim sheets. If you're already familiar with how to use the tool in Substance Designer, you can use the timestamp in the description to skip ahead to the section titled Painter-Specific Issues, where I'll describe the different workflow involved in using the tool in Substance Painter. So with that said, this video is mostly aimed at people who either don't have access to Substance Designer or don't need easy access to the masks available for each trim element or the height map output. You do have access to those things in Painter, they're just a lot easier to get to in Substance Designer. If you're not already familiar with this tool, it was made to help with creating textures for use with the Ultimate Trim technique that was developed at Insomniac Games. I talked about that a little more in depth in the designer video, but if you want to learn about the technique, you should check out Insomniac's GDC presentation, which I'll link to in the description of this video. Alright, so let's start talking about how to set up a trim sheet in Substance Painter. And so it's real simple to get started. You'll just use your 3D app of choice and create a very basic one polygon plane, which in my case would be Blender. And then what you need to do is take that plane and UV map it, that one polygon, such that it fills up all of 0 to 1 UV space. And so you will export that as either an OBJ or an FBX and go into Substance Painter, create a new project. I'm going to work at 2K resolution and DirectX. Because I typically work in Unreal 4, I'll turn on compute tangent space per fragment, though it really won't matter because you're not going to be using this model. And so we'll just select the export. In my case, I named an FBX trim plane. Open it up. And you can't see anything until you pan around. We'll hold Shift to snap into place. And so now we have our basic plane set up. And so let's take a look. In the downloads, I included two different versions of the SBS AR for Substance Painter. And so the older one is for people who have much older versions of Substance Painter because there's an issue with switching between DirectX and OpenGL normal formats in the older version. In the more recent version, it's really as simple as going into your project configuration and switching this here, and it'll work out just fine. But in the older versions, I included a switch in the settings for the SBS AR to switch between OpenGL and DirectX. So that will help people with older versions, essentially. So in this case, I'm going to use the recent version. I'm just going to drag it into my tool shelf. And so I've decided to use this as a base material. It's called generator, but we're not going to use it as a generator. We have more flexibility by using a base material. And for now, I'm just going to import it into my current session. All right, and so down here is what it created. Just drag it here. No, that didn't work. There we go. And so just to get started, we can select one of the presets I've included since we've decided to work at 2K resolution. We'll set that up. And so this is our entire material, but if we cycle through, we'll see that we're working with a normal map. And that is all we're working with by default. Now, just to show you what I described a minute ago about switching normal map formats, we'll go into project configuration and switch to OpenGL. And in the newer versions of Substance Painter, that will automatically flip for you. Now, if you're using an older Substance Painter, that seems to not change things. So in this project, I've just gone ahead and imported the older version that I described a minute ago, the Substance Painter older SBSAR. So we'll delete this one, drag this one in. And so if we're back with the DirectX, switching to OpenGL is just a matter of going under the Bevels tab and toggling this way. To get started with creating trims, we'll go to the Trim Heights tab, and the first trim will start at the top of the image, and each trim will move down from that sequentially. It's looking for an input in pixels. So if we start with 64, we've got 64 pixels, and we'll have to pay attention to the resolution that we're working with to make sure that we don't use more pixels than we have to work with. And so in this example, you'll notice that there's some blank space at the bottom, and what we can do is we can use the bottom trim widths to fill that with some partial width trims. And so the way that that works is we start at the bottom right corner and we enter in the width in pixels, and each trim after that will sequentially move to the left. Now, if you'd rather have your trim elements at the bottom starting on the left side, you can either eyeball it with this adjust bottom start position, or you can do a little math and determine how much space was left over. In this case, it would be 352. And so you just have to make note that these bottom trim widths will fill up all of the remaining blank space. So if I go up here and change this, we're going to end up with much taller trim widths, or much taller trim heights, because there's a lot more blank space left. Now, the downfall to using pixels instead of percentages is that if we change between our resolution, we'll end up with some weird results. And so if we end up using more pixels than we have to work with, we're going to get results that we don't expect. So we have to pay attention to that. The reason I opted for using pixels instead of percentages is it seemed like a more user-friendly approach to creating these trim sheets than having to do a bunch of math to compute long floating point percentages. If I end up being wrong and some people contact me and say that they'd much rather have percentages, then I might make a separate version that will have the percentages instead of the pixels. But so far I've had pretty good feedback about using pixels instead of percentages. So to adjust the bevels that we've created, we can go into the Bevels tab, and this uniform edge size will allow you to adjust all of the bevels for all of the trim elements in a uniform way. Now, one of the things that's currently working differently in Substance Painter, and appears to be a bug, is that you cannot overdrive the values in these sliders in an SBSAR file. So in order to alleviate the problems caused by that, I've made this slider go up to a value of 10, which hopefully no one needs to go beyond. But essentially, you can't type in a value to go beyond it. In the Substance Designer version, I had this set up so it would go between 0 and 5. And if you wanted to overdrive, you could just type in a value and it would go above it. So hopefully 10 is sufficient for most users. Now, if you want to adjust the bevel thickness of individual trim elements, we can go down here and there's a Customize tab for each individual trim element. So if we want to adjust the fourth element here, we can just enable that. And if we want to adjust the first bottom element here, do the same thing. And something else that I've enabled is this round bevel normals. And let me zoom in so that you can get an idea of what's going on there. And so by default, this is just going to be a sharp 45-degree angle. But if you enable this, it gives you a type of rounding, which in the Substance Designer video I demonstrated in Unreal 4 how that looks. Another thing that you'll notice as I'm zoomed in here is that there's a bit of pixelation going on in these corners. And what you can do is enable this blur, a slight blur, to get rid of that. And so we'll just add some blurring, and that'll nicely round that over. Now, one of the things that happens when you do that is the spots, or where two trim elements meet, tends to bleed over into the colors bleed together. So I've enabled the ability to mask that out from the blurring. You can do that by enabling the mask here. And the default settings tend to work fairly well with 2K resolution. But if you're working at a different resolution or it doesn't work well for your particular trim sheet, I've given you these two sliders to adjust how thick the mask is. And so if we do this, you can see some of that pixelation coming back in as the mask gets larger. And we can go back down. And that'll adjust it for all of the top elements of the trim. And if we go down here, you can see a little bit of pixelation. We can go down a little bit, mask things out, or go up. And last, I've given you the ability to remove the side bevels for all of the top elements. So what that'll do is allow you to continuously tile in a horizontal way these top elements, but it's not going to have any effect on these bottom trim elements. Alright, so now it's time to talk about some of the painter specific issues. And so when I'm talking about that, I'm mostly referring to the custom input, the height map, and masks. And so let's start with the height map. In order to access the height map, it's not as simple as just pressing height. And the reason it's not that simple is because by doing that, you're going to mess up your 45-degree normal map angles. And so just to show you why that's the case, if I go into height right here in the channels mapping portion of our generator, I've named it custom height specifically so it won't automatically go in height. And what happens if we go over to our normal height plus mesh view, you can see that all the normal map angles have changed. And that's going to ruin your 45-degree bevels. And so if you want to access the height map, you're either wanting to access it because you don't care about the 45-degree angles, or you'll access it to use it for some sort of detailing purpose. And so the best way to do that is to access it through a custom channel. And so I'll turn off height now. We'll go into our texture set settings, and what we'll do is we'll add a new channel. We're going to use user 0. You can rename it if you want. We're going to match up the type of data to the typical height data. Going to be a linear 16 float. And so now what we can do is we can enable user 0 and plug in that custom height data. So if we cycle through, now we have user 0 and it has our height data. And so accessing masks is essentially the same process. What we'll need to do is go in and create a new channel. Let's use user 1 this time. And since it's just pure black and white data, we'll probably be just fine with a linear 8. And so we'll enable user 1. And so one of the first things that you might see is this mask right here, and that's going to throw you off. Ignore it, because what happens when you use this mask is it masks all of the data. So for instance, we choose trim mask 1, we lose all of the extra data in our height map as well as our normal map, and so our entire material just loses all the data. So basically you just want to keep that set at no alpha. Now what we can do here is in our user 1 we can give it trim mask 1, and let's go back into cycling through our channels. So user 0 is our height, and user 1 is going to be our trim mask 1. And so some of you may have already seen the real drawback to doing it this way is that Substance Painter only gives you a total of 8 channels, and we have a total of up to 24 different trim elements that we can use in order to get all of our masks. And so the workaround for that is that you can essentially duplicate this layer and then create different masks on multiple layers. So if on your first setup you've used all 8 custom channels, you could just duplicate the layer. Just show this as an example. We don't need the normal data at all because we already have that on our base layer, but we're just going to be using custom data here. And so for instance, what we can do in this one is we can change our user 0 to say mask 2, for instance, and maybe mask 3 here for user 1, and that'll just show you here. User 1 gets let's just cycle through it again, make sure that this is disabled so that I know which one I'm looking at. But alright, so user 0 we got 2, and alright, I used the same one, my mistake. So user trim mask 3 under user 1. It gets confusing, and you're already starting to see why this isn't nearly as efficient as Substance Designer. But so if, for example, we wanted to mask out our channels, like we wanted to give a different color to different elements using masks, what we could do is we could add a fill layer, and we're only going to work with color data. So let's give everything a color of red. And what we'll do is we'll set up a new color for this first trim and the second trim. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is use anchor points. And so in this right here, I'm going to add an anchor point. We'll call this trim 1. And on this one here, I'm going to add another anchor point. I'll call this trim 2. And so I'll add 2 more fill layers. I'll actually put those up top. So we're only going to use color data. So let's make this one pure blue. And let's go into this one. We'll make this one pure green. So what we'll do in order to access those anchor points is we'll add a black mask. Now we'll add a fill, and we'll go in and grab those anchor points, and let's choose trim 1, and we're gonna have to go down here and we're gonna have to reference the channel that we want to do. So I've already kind of forgotten which ones we used. That's our height map, we don't want to use that. Alright, so user 1, we've got this one. Now for blue, we'll go in here and do the same thing. We'll add a black mask, add a fill, grab our anchor point, trim 2, reference a channel, And so now we've gotten and we've masked the different elements. And so hopefully this exercise has been an example of this is way easier in Substance Designer. But it's doable if you're in a pinch and you only have Substance Painter. It's certainly possible to go in and use your masks and use your height map output to do this sort of thing. One of the other things I want to talk about is the custom input for creating rectangular 45-degree normal map bevels. And so the easiest way to do that is to use a texture, which, let me just import a new texture here. So we can grab that right here. And it's not going to do anything by default because we need to go into our experimental tab and enable that. So there, we've got our custom input. Let's go back into the normal. You can see that it's working properly with the proper colors and the proper rounding. Now, the big problem here is that works fine with bitmaps that I've imported from elsewhere. But if I want to use some of the procedural things that exist in Substance Painter, it'll work fine so long as you're not using the normal map rounding. So if, for instance, I were to go in here and choose a polygon 1, we have to make sure that we change this to 4-sided because this only works with rectangular shapes. So we'll see that we've got a polygon 1 rectangle in here, but the rounding no longer works. And that appears to just be some sort of data problem with what's going on with the procedurals inside of Substance Painter. If we turn off our rounding, we get the proper angles, proper sharp bevels, but for whatever reason the internal tools inside of Painter don't appear to work properly with the round bevel normals for custom inputs. So that about sums up the differences. If I wanted to summarize the way I would use this tool, I would do as much as I can in Substance Designer. And then when it came time to do some hand painting or some stamping, I would export my maps from Substance Designer and then use those in Substance Painter to do the cool hand-painted stuff that you can do in Painter. But hopefully I've cleared up how to use this tool in Painter for anyone who only has access to Painter. And thank you for watching. If you'd like to get in touch with me about this tool, if you have any questions or issues, feel free to send me a message on ArtStation or an email at jlazaro@scumbrella.com. If you've noticed anything that could be improved upon as far as workflow in Substance Painter, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a message, and thanks for watching.